The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Veterans Memorial Hospital in San Diego when Detective Maria Santos first laid eyes on the woman who would challenge everything she thought she knew about military service. The woman stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, her graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing a simple Navy uniform that looked like it had seen better days. Nothing about her appearance suggested she was anything other than another veteran seeking medical care. Detective Santos had received the call at 6:30 that morning. A hospital administrator reported that a woman had been attempting to receive medical benefits by claiming to be a former Navy SEAL. The administrator, Michael Peterson, had grown suspicious when the woman could not provide proper documentation and seemed evasive about her service record. In an era where stolen valor cases were becoming increasingly common, Peterson felt it was his duty to report the potential fraud. Sarah Mitchell sat quietly in the hospital waiting room, unaware that law enforcement had been contacted. At 58 years old, she carried herself with a confidence that seemed at odds with her current circumstances. Her hands, weathered and scarred, rested calmly in her lap as she waited for her name to be called. She had been seeking treatment for chronic pain in her back and legs, injuries she claimed were service-related from her time in special operations. The first red flag for Peterson had been Sarah's reluctance to provide detailed service records. When pressed about her SEAL training, she had given vague answers and changed the subject. She could not produce the typical documentation that most veterans carried, and her knowledge of SEAL traditions and protocols seemed sketchy at best. Peterson had served in the Navy himself for 8 years and prided himself on being able to spot false claims from a mile away. Detective Santos approached Sarah with the practiced calm of someone who had handled dozens of similar cases. Stolen valor investigations had become a regular part of her workload, and she had developed a methodical approach to uncovering the truth. Most cases involved individuals who had fabricated entire military careers, often for financial gain or social status. Santos expected this case to follow the same predictable pattern. When Santos introduced herself and asked to speak privately with Sarah, the older woman's reaction was not what the detective expected. Instead of the nervous denial or aggressive defensiveness she usually encountered, Sarah simply nodded and gathered her belongings with resigned acceptance. There was something in her eyes that Santos could not immediately identify, a depth that seemed inconsistent with someone perpetrating a simple fraud. They moved to a small conference room where Santos began her standard questioning. Sarah's responses were measured and careful, but not in the way Santos was accustomed to from fraudsters. When asked about her service dates, Sarah provided specific years but remained vague about locations and operations. When pressed about SEAL training, she acknowledged that her path had been unconventional, but refused to elaborate without legal representation present. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Santos asked about Sarah's knowledge of classified operations. Most stolen valor cases involved individuals who claimed participation in well-known missions that had been publicized in movies or books. Sarah, however, referenced operations that Santos had never heard of, using terminology that seemed authentic but unfamiliar. When Santos pressed for more details, Sarah simply stated that some aspects of her service remained classified and that she could not discuss them without proper clearance verification. Hospital Administrator Peterson joined the questioning, bringing with him a folder of documentation he had compiled during his initial investigation. He had contacted several veterans organizations and had been unable to find any record of Sarah's claimed service. The Department of Defense database showed no listing for a Sarah Mitchell with the service dates she had provided. Peterson was confident that he had caught another case of stolen valor red-handed. Sarah listened to Peterson's accusations with a calm that seemed to frustrate him. When he presented his evidence, she acknowledged the absence of records but suggested that there might be explanations beyond simple fraud. She mentioned that certain military personnel had their service records classified or compartmentalized for security reasons. Peterson dismissed this as a desperate attempt to avoid accountability, pointing out that such classifications were extremely rare and certainly would not apply to someone seeking routine medical care. The situation escalated when Peterson demanded that Sarah submit to immediate arrest for fraud. Detective Santos, however, felt that something was not quite right about the case. Sarah's demeanor and knowledge suggested either an extremely sophisticated fraud or something more complex than simple stolen valor. Santos decided to conduct a more thorough investigation before making any arrests, despite Peterson's insistence that the evidence was clear-cut. As the questioning continued, Sarah made a request that surprised both Santos and Peterson. She asked to speak with Admiral James Harrison, who was currently stationed at the Naval Base San Diego. She claimed that the Admiral would be able to verify her service record and clear up any confusion. Peterson scoffed at this, suggesting that involving a high-ranking officer in what he considered an obvious fraud case was inappropriate and potentially embarrassing for the Navy. Detective Santos found herself in an unusual position. Her training and experience suggested that Sarah was likely guilty of stolen valor, but her instincts told her that there was more to the story. The woman's knowledge of military protocols, her calm demeanor under pressure, and her specific request to contact Admiral Harrison all seemed inconsistent with typical fraud cases. Santos decided to pursue the lead, despite Peterson's objections. The phone call to Admiral Harrison's office was initially met with resistance from his staff. A civilian detective asking to verify the service record of someone claiming to be a former SEAL was not an unusual request, and the Admiral's aides were accustomed to dealing with stolen valor cases. However, when Santos mentioned Sarah's name and the specific request to speak with the Admiral personally, there was a noticeable pause in the conversation. Admiral Harrison's aide requested that Santos hold while he consulted with the Admiral directly. The wait stretched on for nearly 20 minutes, far longer than Santos expected for what should have been a routine verification. When the aide returned to the phone, his tone had changed completely. He informed Santos that Admiral Harrison would personally come to the hospital to address the situation, and he requested that no further action be taken until the Admiral arrived. Peterson was incredulous at this development. He argued that involving an admiral in what he considered a clear-cut fraud case was a waste of military resources and potentially damaging to naval prestige. He pushed for immediate arrest, citing the lack of documentation and Sarah's evasive answers as sufficient evidence of guilt. Santos, however, decided to wait for Admiral Harrison's arrival before proceeding. The tension in the hospital conference room was palpable as they waited for the Admiral. Sarah remained calm, almost serene, while Peterson paced and muttered about the absurdity of the situation. Santos found herself studying Sarah more closely, looking for clues that might explain the woman's confidence in the face of seemingly overwhelming evidence against her. Sarah's hands drew Santos's attention. They bore scars that looked consistent with military service, including what appeared to be shrapnel marks and burn tissue. Her posture was straight and disciplined, and she responded to questions with the precision Santos associated with military training. When Peterson stepped out to make phone calls, Santos asked Sarah directly about her scars. For the first time during the questioning, Sarah's composure showed a crack. She looked down at her hands and was quiet for a long moment before responding. She explained that the scars were from operations that she could not discuss in detail, but that they served as daily reminders of sacrifices made in service to her country. Her voice carried a weight that Santos found compelling, a sadness that seemed inconsistent with someone fabricating a military career for personal gain. The arrival of Admiral Harrison changed the entire atmosphere of the investigation. The Admiral was an imposing figure, standing well over 6 feet tall with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He wore his dress uniform, and the ribbons and decorations on his chest spoke to a distinguished career in naval service. When he entered the conference room, both Santos and Peterson instinctively stood to attention. Admiral Harrison's eyes immediately found Sarah, and Santos noticed something pass between them, a look of recognition that seemed to contradict Peterson's assertion that Sarah was a fraud. The Admiral did not speak immediately, instead studying Sarah's face with an expression that was difficult to read. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Peterson cleared his throat and began to present his case against Sarah. The Admiral listened to Peterson's presentation without interruption, his face remaining neutral throughout the recitation of evidence. When Peterson finished, Admiral Harrison turned to Detective Santos and asked about the specific charges being considered. Santos explained that no charges had been filed yet, but that the evidence seemed to support a case of stolen valor fraud. Admiral Harrison then did something that shocked everyone in the room. He turned to Sarah and rendered a crisp military salute. Sarah rose from her chair and returned the salute with the precision of someone who had performed the gesture thousands of times. The Admiral held the salute for several seconds before dropping his hand and speaking words that would haunt Detective Santos for years to come. The Admiral's voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute authority when he spoke. He looked directly at Detective Santos and said words that would change everything about the investigation. The room fell silent as the implications of what had just occurred began to sink in. Peterson's face went pale as he realized that his certainty about Sarah's guilt might have been misplaced. Detective Santos found herself looking at Sarah with new eyes, seeing not a fraud, but someone whose service had been so classified, so sensitive, that even decades later it remained hidden from official records. The woman she had been prepared to arrest for stolen valor was apparently something much different, something that required the personal attention of an admiral to resolve. As the truth began to emerge, Santos realized that she was witnessing something unprecedented in her career. The case she had thought would be routine had become something that challenged her understanding of military service and the sacrifices made by those who serve in the shadows. The woman sitting calmly in the hospital conference room was about to reveal a story that few would ever be privileged to hear. The Admiral's presence had transformed the investigation from a simple fraud case into something much more complex and significant. As he prepared to explain Sarah's true background, Santos understood that she was about to learn about aspects of military service that existed beyond public knowledge, where dedication to country required sacrifices that could never be publicly acknowledged or rewarded. The morning that had started with a routine stolen valor investigation was about to become one of the most important days in Detective Santos's career. The woman she had been prepared to arrest was about to be revealed as someone whose service to her country had been so extraordinary that it had remained hidden for decades, known only to a select few who understood the true cost of freedom. Admiral Harrison requested that the conference room be cleared except for Detective Santos and Sarah Mitchell. Hospital Administrator Peterson protested, arguing that he had a right to know what was happening in his facility, but the Admiral's stern gaze silenced his objections. The Admiral explained that what he was about to discuss was classified at levels that required specific clearances, and that only Detective Santos would be permitted to remain as the investigating officer. Once the room was secured, Admiral Harrison took a seat across from Sarah, his demeanor shifting from the formal bearing he had displayed moments earlier to something more personal, almost reverent. He studied Sarah's face for a long moment before speaking, as if confirming details from memories that stretched back decades. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that Detective Santos had never heard before. The Admiral began by explaining that Sarah's military service was indeed real, but that it had been conducted under circumstances so classified that even decades later, most details remained sealed. He told Santos that during the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Navy had experimented with highly classified programs that pushed the boundaries of conventional military operations. These programs often operated outside normal command structures and used personnel whose very existence was compartmentalized for security reasons. Sarah had been recruited into one of these programs while serving as a Navy intelligence analyst. Her background in languages, her psychological profile, and her demonstrated ability to operate under extreme stress had made her an ideal candidate for operations that required complete deniability. The Admiral explained that the nature of her missions was such that maintaining plausible deniability required erasing most traces of her involvement from official records. Detective Santos listened with growing amazement as Admiral Harrison outlined operations that sounded more like fiction than reality. Sarah had been inserted into hostile territories where traditional military presence was impossible, conducting intelligence gathering and sabotage operations that required skills far beyond conventional military training. Her SEAL training had been real, but it had been conducted in facilities that did not officially exist by instructors whose names appeared in no military records. The Admiral revealed that Sarah had been part of a program known internally as Deep Blue, a joint operation between Navy Special Operations and the Central Intelligence Agency. The program's existence was known to fewer than 50 people at its peak, and even fewer knew the identities of the operators involved. Sarah had been one of only 3 women ever selected for Deep Blue operations, and she had completed missions that had saved thousands of American lives while preventing international incidents that could have led to major conflicts. Admiral Harrison's voice grew more somber as he described the personal cost of Sarah's service. Deep Blue operators were required to maintain cover identities that often lasted for years at a time. They could not maintain normal relationships, could not claim credit for their achievements, and often had to watch as others received recognition for operations they had conducted. The psychological toll of such service was enormous, and many operators struggled with the transition back to civilian life. Sarah's final mission for Deep Blue had taken place in 1994, during a crisis in the Balkans that never made international headlines. She had been inserted into a war zone to extract a high-value intelligence asset whose capture would have compromised ongoing peace negotiations. The mission had been successful, but Sarah had been severely injured during the extraction. The injuries she suffered explained the chronic pain she had been seeking treatment for at the hospital. The Admiral explained that after her injury, Sarah had been quietly retired from active service with a cover story that obscured her true contributions. Her medical records had been classified, her service history had been compartmentalized, and she had been provided with a civilian identity that bore no trace of her military service. The intention had been to protect both her and the classified programs she had participated in, but the result was that she had been left without the recognition or benefits that her service had earned. Detective Santos struggled to comprehend the implications of what she was hearing. The woman she had been prepared to arrest for stolen valor had actually been one of the most highly trained and decorated operatives in naval history, but her service was so classified that it appeared she had no military background at all. The irony of the situation was not lost on Santos, as she realized that Sarah's genuine claims of military service looked exactly like the false claims she investigated regularly. Admiral Harrison revealed that he had personally commanded some of the operations that Sarah had participated in during his tenure as a captain in Naval Special Operations. He had been one of the few officers read into the Deep Blue program, and he had watched Sarah complete missions that other operators had considered impossible. Her courage, skill, and dedication had earned the respect of everyone who had worked with her, but security requirements meant that this respect could never be publicly expressed. The Admiral's voice became heavy with emotion as he described the unfairness of Sarah's current situation. A woman who had given everything for her country was being accused of stealing valor because the very nature of her service made it impossible to prove. She had suffered injuries in the line of duty, but could not claim veterans' benefits because her service records were classified. She had earned decorations that could never be publicly displayed and had participated in operations that could never be acknowledged. Sarah spoke for the first time since Admiral Harrison had arrived, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. She explained to Detective Santos that she had known the risks when she accepted assignment to Deep Blue. She had understood that her service would never be acknowledged, and that she would have to live with the knowledge that her sacrifices would remain unknown to the public. What she had not anticipated was how difficult it would be to access basic medical care for service-related injuries without being able to explain how she had sustained them. The Admiral revealed that Sarah's case was not unique. There were dozens of former Deep Blue operatives living throughout the country who faced similar challenges. Their service was real, their sacrifices were genuine, and their need for support was legitimate. But the classified nature of their operations made it nearly impossible for them to receive the recognition or assistance they deserved. Many suffered in silence rather than risk exposure of classified programs. Detective Santos found herself grappling with questions that had no easy answers. How could the system be structured to support veterans whose service could not be acknowledged? How could someone prove their military background when that background was intentionally hidden from official records? The complexity of Sarah's situation challenged everything Santos thought she knew about military service and veterans' benefits. Admiral Harrison explained that he had been working quietly for years to address the problems faced by former Deep Blue operatives. He had established informal networks to provide support and had advocated within Naval Command for policy changes that would allow classified veterans to receive appropriate care. Sarah's case at the hospital had come to his attention because he maintained contact with former operatives and had been monitoring their welfare. The Admiral revealed that he had been expecting something like this to happen eventually. As Deep Blue veterans aged and their service-related injuries worsened, it was inevitable that some would seek medical care and face challenges proving their eligibility. He had been working with Department of Defense officials to develop protocols for handling such cases, but progress had been slow due to the sensitivity of the classified programs involved. Sarah's arrest had forced the issue to a head. Admiral Harrison had decided that the time had come to acknowledge, at least within limited circles, the service of Deep Blue operatives. He had already initiated procedures to declassify enough information about the program to allow former operatives to receive appropriate medical care and recognition. The process would take time, but Sarah's case had accelerated efforts that had been ongoing for years. Detective Santos realized that she was witnessing a historic moment in military affairs. The revelation of Deep Blue operations, even in limited form, would provide closure and recognition for veterans who had served in the shadows for decades. It would also establish precedents for handling similar cases involving other classified programs that undoubtedly existed within the military structure. Admiral Harrison turned to Detective Santos and asked what she intended to do with the information he had provided. He explained that while he could verify Sarah's service to the extent necessary to clear her of fraud charges, much of what he had revealed would need to remain classified. Santos would need to find a way to close the investigation without compromising ongoing security concerns or exposing information that could damage national security. Sarah expressed her gratitude to Admiral Harrison for finally revealing the truth about her service, but she also voiced concern about the exposure of classified information. She had maintained operational security for over 30 years and was uncomfortable with any disclosure that might compromise other operatives or ongoing programs. Her loyalty to the service and her fellow operators remained absolute, even in the face of personal hardship. The Admiral assured Sarah that the disclosures he was making had been carefully considered and approved at the highest levels of Naval Command. The revelation of Deep Blue operations was part of a broader effort to provide appropriate recognition and support for classified veterans while maintaining the security of ongoing programs. Her case had simply provided the catalyst for actions that had been planned for years. Detective Santos found herself in the unique position of being one of the first civilian law enforcement officers to learn about Deep Blue operations. Admiral Harrison explained that her role in resolving Sarah's case would require her to maintain the same level of discretion that had protected the program for decades. The investigation would be classified, and Santos would need to sign agreements acknowledging her exposure to classified information. As the meeting concluded, Admiral Harrison stood and again saluted Sarah, this time explaining to Detective Santos that he was rendering honors due to a decorated veteran whose service had never been properly acknowledged. He stated that Sarah had earned the respect and gratitude of her nation, even though that nation could never publicly express its appreciation for her sacrifices. The transformation in the conference room was complete. What had begun as a stolen valor investigation had become a moment of recognition for service that transcended normal military experience. Detective Santos understood that she had been privileged to witness something extraordinary, a glimpse into the hidden side of military service where dedication to duty required the ultimate sacrifice of anonymity. The truth about Sarah Mitchell had finally emerged, revealing not a fraud, but a genuine American hero whose service had been so classified that it had made her appear to be exactly what she was accused of pretending to be. The irony of the situation would stay with Detective Santos for the rest of her career, a reminder that truth is sometimes stranger and more complex than the most elaborate fiction. Admiral Harrison's final words to Detective Santos were both a warning and a plea. He asked her to remember that there were others like Sarah throughout the country, veterans whose service could not be acknowledged but whose sacrifices were real. He hoped that Sarah's case would lead to better support systems for all veterans, regardless of whether their service could be publicly recognized or celebrated. The weeks following Admiral Harrison's revelation transformed not only Sarah Mitchell's life, but also the careers and perspectives of everyone involved in the investigation. Detective Santos found herself navigating uncharted territory as she worked to close a case that had evolved far beyond anything in her experience. The classified nature of the information she had learned required her to completely restructure her approach to the investigation, balancing the need for justice with the requirements of national security. Hospital Administrator Michael Peterson struggled to come to terms with the truth about Sarah's service. His certainty about her guilt had been absolute, based on years of experience and what had seemed like overwhelming evidence. The revelation that he had been completely wrong about Sarah's background forced him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about identifying fraudulent military claims. The woman he had been so eager to see arrested was actually more qualified than many of the veterans he routinely served without question. Sarah herself began the long process of transitioning from a life of complete anonymity to one where her service could finally be acknowledged, at least within limited circles. The medical treatment she had sought became available through special channels that Admiral Harrison helped establish for classified veterans. For the first time in decades, she could discuss her injuries and their origins with medical professionals who had the necessary clearances to understand her complete medical history. Detective Santos worked closely with Navy legal officers to develop documentation that would officially close the investigation without revealing classified details. The case file would show that the allegations against Sarah had been thoroughly investigated and found to be without merit, but the specific reasons for this determination would remain sealed. This approach protected both Sarah's privacy and the classified information that had exonerated her. The precedent set by Sarah's case began to have wider implications throughout the military healthcare system. Admiral Harrison's advocacy resulted in the creation of new protocols for handling medical claims from veterans whose service records were classified or compartmentalized. These protocols allowed medical professionals to provide appropriate care without requiring full disclosure of classified operations, addressing a gap in the system that had left many veterans without proper support. Peterson implemented new training procedures at Veterans Memorial Hospital to help staff identify legitimate claims that might appear suspicious due to classification issues. He realized that his previous approach had been too focused on documentation and not enough on the individual circumstances that might make standard verification impossible. The training emphasized the importance of involving higher authorities when cases seemed complex, rather than making immediate judgments based on incomplete information. Sarah began connecting with other former Deep Blue operatives through networks that Admiral Harrison had established. For the first time since her retirement, she was able to discuss her service with people who understood the unique challenges of classified military operations. These connections provided emotional support that had been missing from her life for decades, helping her process experiences that she had carried alone for far too long. The broader military community began to grapple with the implications of classified veterans whose service could not be properly acknowledged. Sarah's case highlighted a systemic problem that affected hundreds of former operatives from various classified programs spanning decades of military operations. Admiral Harrison's revelations prompted reviews of policies governing veteran support that had not been updated to address the realities of modern classified operations. Detective Santos received specialized training in handling cases involving classified military information, making her one of the few civilian law enforcement officers qualified to investigate similar cases. Her experience with Sarah's case made her a valuable resource for other jurisdictions facing similar challenges. She developed protocols that other police departments could use when encountering potential stolen valor cases that might involve classified service. Sarah's story became a cautionary tale within military circles about the long-term consequences of classification policies on individual service members. While operational security remained paramount, military leaders began to consider the human cost of policies that made it impossible for veterans to receive proper recognition and support for their sacrifices. The case prompted discussions about balancing security needs with the obligation to care for those who had served. Admiral Harrison's career was profoundly impacted by his decision to reveal the truth about Deep Blue operations. While his actions were ultimately supported by Naval Command, the process of declassifying enough information to support classified veterans required him to navigate complex political and security considerations. His advocacy for these forgotten veterans became a defining aspect of his legacy within the Navy. The resolution of Sarah's case took several months to complete, involving coordination between multiple government agencies and careful review of classification policies. During this time, Sarah remained patient and cooperative, understanding that the process was complicated by the very secrecy that had made her service possible. She worked with military lawyers to ensure that any disclosures made in her case would not compromise ongoing operations or endanger current operatives. Peterson's perspective on veteran fraud cases was permanently altered by his experience with Sarah. He developed a more nuanced approach to evaluating suspicious claims, understanding that the absence of documentation did not necessarily indicate fraud. His hospital became a model for other medical facilities in developing procedures for handling complex verification cases involving classified service. Detective Santos found that her experience with Sarah's case changed her approach to all investigations involving military personnel. She learned to look beyond surface evidence and consider the complex realities of modern military service that might make standard verification procedures inadequate. Her expertise in handling classified information cases made her a sought-after consultant for other law enforcement agencies facing similar challenges. Sarah's medical treatment progressed rapidly once her service-related injuries could be properly documented and addressed. The chronic pain that had driven her to seek treatment was finally acknowledged as legitimate, and she received comprehensive care from medical professionals who understood the full scope of her service-related health issues. For the first time in years, she experienced significant improvement in her quality of life. The emotional impact of finally being able to discuss her service openly, even within limited circles, was profound for Sarah. Decades of maintaining operational security had taken a psychological toll that she had never fully acknowledged. The ability to share her experiences with others who understood the sacrifices required by classified service provided healing that medical treatment alone could not accomplish. Admiral Harrison established an informal support network for classified veterans that operated within legal boundaries while providing much-needed assistance and recognition. The network helped former operatives navigate the challenges of obtaining benefits and medical care while maintaining the security requirements that govern their service. Sarah became an advocate within this network, helping other veterans who faced similar challenges. The legal precedent set by Sarah's case influenced policy changes that extended beyond the Navy to other branches of the military. The Department of Defense began reviewing procedures for supporting veterans whose service records were classified, leading to systemic improvements that would benefit future generations of classified operatives. Sarah's case had inadvertently triggered reforms that had been needed for decades. Peterson's Hospital became a training center for medical professionals learning to work with classified veterans. The protocols developed in response to Sarah's case were shared with other medical facilities, helping to ensure that veterans with similar backgrounds would not face the same challenges Sarah had encountered. The training emphasized the importance of discretion and the need to work through appropriate channels when dealing with complex verification issues. Sarah's integration into veteran communities was carefully managed to protect both her privacy and the classified nature of her service. She was able to participate in veteran organizations and activities while maintaining the operational security that remained necessary even decades after her service. This balance allowed her to experience the camaraderie and support that other veterans took for granted while respecting the ongoing requirements of national security. The investigation that had begun with a routine stolen valor allegation concluded with Sarah being formally recognized as a distinguished veteran whose service, while classified, had contributed significantly to national security. The recognition ceremony was small and private, attended only by those with appropriate clearances, but it provided Sarah with the acknowledgement she had earned through decades of sacrifice and service. Detective Santos often reflected on the lessons learned from Sarah's case during her subsequent investigations. The experience taught her that truth could be far more complex than evidence suggested, and that justice sometimes required looking beyond conventional procedures. She became an advocate for developing better systems to support those whose service to their country required them to remain in the shadows. Admiral Harrison's final act regarding Sarah's case was to ensure that the protocols developed in response to her situation would be institutionalized within military procedures. He worked with Pentagon officials to create formal policies that would prevent future classified veterans from facing the same challenges Sarah had encountered. His efforts ensured that Sarah's difficult experience would lead to lasting improvements for others who had served in similar circumstances. Sarah's story became a powerful reminder of the hidden costs of freedom and the sacrifices made by those who serve in ways that can never be publicly acknowledged. Her case highlighted the need for systems that could support classified veterans while maintaining the security requirements that made their service possible. The resolution of her situation provided hope that the nation could find ways to honor all who serve, even when that service must remain forever in the shadows. The woman who had been arrested for pretending to be a SEAL had proven to be something far more extraordinary than anyone had initially imagined. Her story served as a testament to the complexity of modern military service and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances when evaluating claims of military service. In the end, Sarah Mitchell's case became a legend within law enforcement and military circles, a reminder that sometimes those who appear to be frauds are actually the most genuine heroes of all.